I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Joseph von Nessen now. Dr. von Nessen is research economist in the Division of Research at the Darla Moore School of Business, where he specializes in regional economics, regional economic forecasting, and housing economics. He serves on the advisory committee of the South Carolina Board of Economic Advisors and is a frequent speaker for business and government leaders throughout the Southeast, providing information and consultation about business, housing markets, and local economies. We're really delighted to have him here today to present his work. He's going to speak for about 20 minutes, and then there will be about 10 minutes for questions and answers before we'll turn it over to the next panel. And we know that more questions are likely to emerge throughout the day for Dr. von Nessen, and he will be here at least through the early afternoon to continue to have conversations with all of you. So thank you again, and welcome, Dr. von Nessen.
Okay, how are we doing there? Am I blasting anyone? We're good? Okay, excellent. Make sure we're working here. Perfect. All right, well, good morning again, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate today. It's really a thrill to be here with all of you to share the research that we have been working on in the Moore School of Business with WREN over the last several months. We've been partnering together, and it's a privilege to be able to share the results with you today. And so what I want to do over the next few minutes is to spend some time going over the main findings and talk through what we've discovered looking at the data and what's been happening, particularly in the last decade, and what's been happening here in South Carolina. We hear a lot about differences in outcomes with respect to the gender workforce gap at the national level, but I'm going to talk more about what's happening locally here in South Carolina. And really the bottom line here is when you think about economics and we think about the gender gap in South Carolina from an economic perspective, I think we have to boil it back down to supply and demand and come at it from that perspective. Of course, we all associate economics with supply and demand, and what we have found through this research effort is that there is a significant workforce shortage that is emerging in South Carolina. That's point number one. And that's a workforce shortage that's emerging now, and it's going to continue to develop over the next decade. And South Carolina is going to need more workers in our economy in order to keep the economic growth going that we're currently seeing. And so this provides a very unique opportunity, I think, for WREN as we move ahead over the next decade in order for them to have the opportunity to match women to the opportunities that are currently presenting themselves in the marketplace and to match these opportunities with the demand, again, that exists in the marketplace today. So what I want to do over the next few minutes is talk about where we are in South Carolina right now, look at the landscape, and then also address how meeting these needs has the potential to significantly increase economic activity in South Carolina, and at the same time help to reduce some of the gender gaps that we're currently seeing in the workforce in South Carolina. So starting out, let's talk briefly about what's happening in terms of what the landscape looks like right now, today in South Carolina. So the way we're going to measure this is to take a look at three factors. I want to start out and talk about how those influence gender gaps that we typically see in wages. When we typically think about gender gaps in the workforce, we normally associate that with a wage gap, but there are other contributions as well, and these are three of the major ones that have been identified at the national level by the McKinsey Institute. So I want to go through each one of these fairly quickly. The number of hours worked, we see, also the labor force participation rate and the distribution of employment across different industrial sectors. So let's take a moment and see what that looks like. So first of all, if we look at the average weekly hours worked in South Carolina, we can see that there is a significant difference here between men and women, and this has persisted certainly for the last 10 years and has actually been fairly stable. We haven't seen a whole lot of change or progress on this variable, and what this tells us is that on average, men are working, or rather women are working about 87% of the number of hours that men are as of 2015, and we can see that that's remained fairly flat compared to 2005. Again, not much of a change there. Also, if we look at this from the perspective of full versus part-time workers, again, we get a very similar picture here in terms of a significant difference between men and women, men more likely to be working full-time. And again, this points to of the total number of men working, what this tells us is about 89% are working full-time relative to women. Of all women working full-time, that is 35 hours or more per week, about 77% are working full-time. So again, a fairly significant difference here between the two. Another aspect that we can look at in terms of getting a picture of what the landscape looks like right now is the labor force participation rate. So what is the difference here? Now, what you can see, what we've tried to show here is that if we look at men and women by age, we can see that there is a gap in the labor force participation rate across all ages, across the age spectrum. Now, one point I think that's important to emphasize here when we look at these trends is that, again, these trends persist across all age groups, including younger women. And one of the things that I'm going to point out in just a moment is that when we look at the pay gap between men and women, that tends to be progressive over time, meaning that it is larger for 50-year-olds than it is for 30-year-olds. So it builds over time. So if we look at the labor force participation rate and the differences here, and we look at the fact that it's significant even for younger women, what this tells us, one conclusion we can draw, is that right off the bat, whether coming out of high school or coming out of college, because men and women already have these differences in their participation rates in the labor force, that means that women are less likely to be building experience, less likely to be networking, and doing all of the other things that allows them to, that causes part of the progressive separation of the wage gap over time for older workers as opposed to younger workers. So I think focusing perhaps on younger workers here and that labor force gap will is a good way to address this labor force gap in terms of addressing the wage gap as a result of that. We can also look at employment. Overall employment changes and the distribution across across genders. We see that gender differences vary significantly depending on the occupation types that we look at. So it's certainly not the same across all occupation types. I'm going to go through some specific ones here in just a moment. One of the things that we found that occupations that have been traditionally male-dominated continue to be in 2015, meaning we haven't seen a whole lot of changes, certainly not in the last decade, with one major exception. One major exception is actually the military, and we can look at these data here. You can get a sense. These are the ones that have occupations that 20% or fewer workers in these occupations are female. And again, I'm not going to go through each one of these in particular, but I do want to emphasize again that if we look at where women have made gains in the last 10 years, you can see here that the military is one where we've seen a substantial increase from about 15% to about 27%. Now, we don't know why this is the case. We don't know if this is an active or a program or an active effort that the military is putting into recruiting women, but I think that is something that we need to take seriously and to look at, because if there is a model there that they are implementing in the military, that could be something that could potentially be built upon or replicated in the private sector. And given that it is fairly unique among these occupations in terms of these percentage changes, in occupations that have been historically male-dominated, there may be something there that we can build on going forward. So again, an important factor to consider as we look ahead. Some other occupations that we can look at. Again, I don't want to go through the specifics here, but just to point out that there are differences across occupation types. These are ones that are more dominated by women. And again, you can see the differences in the percentages across time. Again, looking at 2005 versus 2015. What about educational attainment? A couple of other factors in terms of assessing the economic landscape and where we are. Well, it turns out that in general, women are more highly educated than men are in South Carolina. And we can see this across the spectrum, regardless of whether we're looking at the bachelor's degree level, so bachelor's degree or higher. We see that about 29% of women in South Carolina hold a bachelor's degree or higher compared to 25% of men. And it's also true at the associate's degree level. So again, 34% there versus 28%. So I think one of the main takeaways here is that because women are in general, again, more educated than men in South Carolina, if we're looking for opportunities and ways to address the gender gaps in the workforce and the gender wage gaps in the workforce, looking at education at a broad level may not be the focal point that needs to be looked at. Again, because at a broad level, women already have higher educational attainment than men. And I'm going to come back to another point in just a moment to talk about how women can take advantage of this advantage that they already hold in the workplace. But again, I think from a broad perspective, focusing on education, we need to be careful about how that is implemented. Now, if we look at educational attainment across industry groups, we also don't see a whole lot of difference in education within industries, meaning that across the board, if we look at the largest industry groups, we don't see much of a difference between the educational attainment of men and women. There are 3 notable exceptions, which I highlight here. But in these cases, it's more because we see specific occupations within these industries where it looks like men and women are in different specific occupations that require significantly different levels of education. So for example, if we look at healthcare and social assistance, it turns out that men are much more likely to be physicians, women are more likely to be in home healthcare, to be home healthcare aides, for example. So positions that require very different levels of education. But again, these 3 industry groups are the exception rather than the norm. For the most part, we don't see much of a difference in terms of educational attainment here within industries. So all of this, when we look across the board, once again, these are 3 factors that lead to the existing wage gaps by gender in South Carolina. And I mentioned before that this is a progressive gap, meaning that it gets larger with age, as workers age. So as you can see, starting on the left, men and women between the ages of 25 and 34, you can see the gap is still present among younger workers, but it's certainly much smaller than it is once you get to 45 to 54-year-olds or 55 to 64-year-olds. And again, a number of reasons for that, but I go back to the previous point that because women and men are in the labor force at different rates right from the get-go, right out of school, when they are very young, that they're already that differences emerge immediately that are going to lead to this progressive pay gap over time. So I think this is a very important factor to focus on and to make note of. Now, we are also seeing a decline in the pay gap in South Carolina. So if it is increasing when we look across the age, but if we look across time, overall, we actually see that the pay gap is decreasing. It has decreased since 2005. We can see currently it's about 73%, meaning that women earn on average in South Carolina about 73% of what men earn if we just look at full-time workers here. Now, this may be a number, you may look at that and say, wait a minute, I've seen a different number. This may not be the one that I'm used to seeing if I'm looking at a national level study or maybe some other numbers. But what I want to reassure you is that these figures can be different depending on which metric that we're using. So we can look at full-time versus part-time workers. We can look at the mean wage. We can look at the median wage. We can look at hours worked. So there are a number of different ways that we can measure this pay gap. So if the 73%, if that number looks unfamiliar to you for any reason, it's probably because we're looking at the variable that we're measuring here is slightly different than maybe the one that you're used to seeing there. But the bottom line here, again, as we've seen, it's improved from about 67% in 2005 to about 73% where it stands as of the end of 2015. So that gives us a sense of the overall picture in terms of where we stand right now in South Carolina, what the gender gap looks like, whether we're looking at the wage gap or any number of other factors that contribute to that wage gap. But I want to come back to where we're headed. And so where do we go from here? And I think it comes back once again to the fact that South Carolina has an emerging labor shortage. And this is a unique opportunity for WREN and for all of you to help identify ways that women can come into the labor force and meet this demand. Because it's a demand that is in existence right now in South Carolina and it's going to persist going forward. And we can see this very clearly when we look at the data in South Carolina. So let me spend a couple of minutes and see if I can convince you of this labor shortage and the evidence that we're seeing for it. So let's start out by looking at what's been happening over the last several years. So South Carolina has been doing fairly well in terms of our overall rate of economic growth since 2010, since the end of the Great Recession. And we've seen steady employment gains that you can very clearly see has resulted in a significant decline in the unemployment rate in South Carolina, down from about 11.7% where it peaked back in 2010 to 4.4% where we are today in 2017. Now, what happens when that unemployment rate comes down? That just means that more and more workers are able to find employment, and so this is good news for South Carolinians in general. Most people now that are actively looking for work are able to find a job. So from a worker's perspective, this is very positive. But from an employer's perspective, this simply means that it's harder for them to find the workers that they need in order to fill demand as they're looking to continue to expand and respond to the market in general. And so we see, as a result of that, a steady rise in wage growth. This puts an upward pressure on wages in South Carolina. And you can see that it's seen a fairly significant change, certainly in the last several years, in terms of the slope of that line. So they're rising, wages are rising at a faster rate. And so this has basically created a labor shortage because we're expecting to continue to see gains in demand in South Carolina going forward. But if we actually look at the number of people coming into the labor force moving forward, we're seeing that once again, there's a significant gap there. We're anticipating right now that there are going to be about 40,000 jobs per year over the next decade in South Carolina that will be in demand. And only about 13,000 or so of those are going to be able to be filled by population increases in South Carolina, which leaves a shortage of about 26,000 jobs per year. That's a significant shortage there that's going to have to be filled. And if you talk to employers, which we do, we survey them, we interview them, they talk constantly about not being able to find the workers that they need. So once again, this is a unique opportunity to increase the labor force participation rate of women to fill these positions and create a net gain for South Carolina's economy, and again, at the same time, help to reduce that wage gap. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over that particular graph, but I think it's important to, again, recognize this shortage and that this is a real opportunity for WREN, particularly if we look at placing women in roles across occupations, again, to address this labor force shortage. So what is that going to actually look like in terms of an economic impact? Well, if we look at that shortage and we say, and we find an opportunity for women to fill the majority of those positions, then basically what we're talking about is a potential impact in South Carolina of about $5.2 billion in new economic activity that would not exist otherwise. Now, why do we say that would not exist otherwise? Because this is a demand that currently exists in South Carolina's economy, and we don't know where these workers are going to come from. So again, to the extent that women can increase their role in the labor force, can meet these demands, this is new economic activity that's there that we need in order to keep the economic growth going that we have seen since the end of the Great Recession. Now, at the same time, what will that do in terms of the gender wage gap, in terms of the workforce participation? Well, about 48% currently of our workforce consists of women. That would be boosted to about 54%. And we would also see the gender wage gap drop from about 27% to about 19% if this were to occur. So you see there's a lot of potential here. Again, both meeting a demand, meeting an existing labor force demand in South Carolina, and at the same time helping to reduce the gender wage gap going forward. And finally, I will conclude by talking a bit more about when I mentioned before that women typically are educated to a higher level than men are in South Carolina, and this provides, once again, an advantage for them, particularly when we're looking at high education, high wage positions. If we look at this shortage and we break it down by position, what we find is about 3 in 10 are among those that require the highest levels of education. So I'll list those here. I won't go through them again in too much detail. But the point here is that if we identify these occupations that require the highest levels of education, this provides, again, an opportunity to match women who are already highly educated and on average more educated than men are in South Carolina with these positions that, again, are in demand in South Carolina's economy right now. So education is important, but it's important to focus on it in the appropriate way, not just increasing the levels and the amounts of education, but also taking advantage of the education that women already have by placing them and guiding them towards market needs, which we can see exist right now in 2017 in South Carolina. So, just to wrap up, there is a significant emerging labor force shortage in South Carolina that exists now and that is going to persist over at least the next decade. And this represents a unique opportunity for WREN to encourage women to come into the labor force at a greater rate and to participate and take these jobs, and that accomplishes multiple goals. On the one hand, it creates a net gain in economic activity in South Carolina of as much as about $5.2 billion per year in the state for the next decade. And at the same time, it has the opportunity to significantly reduce the gender gaps across measures that we look at in the workforce, but most especially the wage gap there. So I will stop there. Thank you very much for your attention. And depending on our time, I'll be happy to take some questions. Okay, go ahead.
You showed the difference in full-time and part-time jobs for men and women. My experience is that women tend to work multiple part-time jobs, which may actually bring our hours up way above being men. Is that factored in any way?
Well, this is just looking at, so in this case we are, the short answer is no, that's not going to be factored into these data. So we're just looking at, on average, those differences. Exactly.
So based on the job or the individual?
In this case, it's going to be based on the job.
Okay.
Yes. Yes, ma'am.
If you could go back to the slide on the gender wage gap across the age ranges, I noticed that where that gap really emerges widely is basically at women's peak childbearing years. Am I right? Is that what I saw?
I believe that it's fairly consistent except for the 45 to 54-year-olds. That's where it drops.
Go back one.
Oh, you wanted to look at,
Other way.
Right there.
yeah.
It goes from the $6,000 wage gap to a $12,000 wage gap at sort of that peak childbearing time. Childbearing time, yeah. Just an observation.
Yep, that's right. And for labor force participation, that drops at the 45, from 45 to 54, correct. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question for you. If you go back to the slide where you saw the percentage growth by industry, where the top two were healthcare and educational services.
Right.
Two questions. How do you define educational services? And if you go down that chart, it looked like it was only a 2% increase in the computer and technology field. And that's all we hear about is, the labor shortage with regard to technology. Has that gone down?
So you're talking about, so you're saying if we look at the occupation distribution, you notice that the percentage of women in those occupations haven't changed.
No. What you're looking at is an increase by 2025.
Right.
The top two being healthcare and education.
Yes.
And technology being much further down.
Right. Well, I mean, there are, it depends on the specific fields that we're looking at, but if we look at healthcare and others, so healthcare is we know that's going to be a hot spot in terms of demand going forward because of the aging of the baby boomers. So there are other fields that go along with that. I mean, you're right that STEM is an important field, but it's not the only one that we see. And especially when we start breaking it down by education, it varies. But healthcare is been consistently number one. And if we look at just general occupational demand, the biggest shortage is among nurses. We're in desperate need for nurses in South Carolina. This is true across the country too. So healthcare is definitely at the central point of this as well.
And how do you define educational services?
I'll have to look specifically, but that's a broad category that looks across the board, whether we're looking at K through 12, at higher ed, it encompasses all of that. It's pretty broad-based.
Real quick, just on this slide, it's a comment in general, and I think it's actually really well reflected. But it's important to keep in mind that the first 10 to 15 years of a person's career really defines the most growth in that career, especially in terms of wages. As you can see, between the 39 to 52%. After that, your careers tend to stagnate, where you don't receive as much promotion, you don't move across industries as much, and you don't receive as many increases in salary. So that kind of critical age between 25 and 35, I think it's one of the most important to focus on, just because after that, your career tends to plateau.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and that's what we see as well, and that goes back to the point that we were making about the labor force participation rate, and how if that can be increased among younger women, again, exactly as you say, when we're networking and building experience and all these other things, if there's a gap there, that's just going to be exacerbated over time, and that effect is cumulative, which is one of the reasons why we see this wage gap increase over time. Exactly.
So in the slide where you talk about the gender wage gap decreasing from 27% in 2017 to 19% in 2025, that's good. I'm just wondering if you have any calculations taking into consideration if the decrease continued at that rate, how long it would take for us to achieve parity?
So that's a great question. We have not looked at that specifically, but I think it's a complicated question, because we have to look at when we can't just bring new people into the labor force. It's always going to be constrained by demand. And that's why I think this is a powerful opportunity in 2017, because we have this shortage that didn't exist just 5 or 6 years ago. So it's hard to project out further, because it's hard to get a sense of what that shortage is going to look like, because we don't know. But I think that it's important when we do that, just to keep in mind that we're always going to be constrained by demand. And right now, our conclusion is that is a goal that WREN perhaps can set, or something to achieve at a broad level. And that's a realistic assessment of where we could be 10 years from now, based on the constraints that the labor markets are showing right now in terms of overall demand. So we can come up front here.
One moment.
Okay.
So, quick question: is there, and this is from a Freakonomics nerd, is there?
That's good. I love Freakonomics.
I know, isn't it great? I love them. Is there any idea, even not even based on gender, but it seems that as markets start to influence and things start getting bigger, I've always said we need more job creators, not necessarily jobs. So, do you have any data for people who, even though that basically become entrepreneurs or business owners? I know I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, but anything like that, like once they reach it, I guess any idea out of the next 10 years who in the labor force are actually going to be not necessarily employed, but the employer? Any ideas about that, just in general?
That's hard to speculate on. If you're talking about which occupations are likely to produce, or
yeah.
I don't have any specific data on that, but I think that it's more, perhaps a better way to look at that is just to look at the types of industries that are likely to generate more startups, whether that's in research or in IT, or if you look at the research areas in South Carolina and say, well, where do we see the startups from there? That may be a better way to get some data for that, but I don't have any comments specifically offhand to address that.
Hey, it looks like this presentation was geared towards taking advantage of the higher level of education already seen in women. I was wondering if you also did any research on non-traditional female fields like the construction trades, specifically skilled trades that don't require a higher level of education, but we're seeing huge demand in my industry, and the men aren't there to fill it, frankly.
Right. Well, I can say with construction, that's definitely a historically male-dominated field if we look at those occupation groupings. So there's definitely opportunity there as well for women to increase their labor force participation. We haven't seen that in construction, but that's, I think, is another opportunity. And in a sense, if we look at I think if we're looking to increase women's participation in different occupations, there have to be different strategies at the industry level or at the occupation level, because we have to look at why that's the case. Why have women participated more in some industries or occupations than others? I can't answer that question, but I think that if we look at those differences, we can begin to ask those questions as to why, and then address it based on the answers that we come up with. It's definitely not a one-size-fits-all approach.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Good morning. Just something to supplement what you said about job creation at the entrepreneurial level. It's also important to note within the context of this presentation that, and I forget the years specifically, but within the next 10 years, half of all jobs are going to be contract-based. So we're going to be working independently, project-based, not necessarily, in factories, in offices as we know it today. The bricks and mortar paradigm is indeed underway. So I think that's very important. We can talk all day about the labor force, and indeed in South Carolina we've been talking about this for over a decade, and I don't see much progress from the corporate level about this. And child care cost is a huge, huge problem. I'll transfer to Dr. Salini.
Just wanted to ask, can you slice and dice this data by race, by geographic area, by income level? Because that could give us also some insights. Is it possible to do that?
Yes, and we actually did that to some degree in the report, which will be available later in the week at the WREN website, and I believe we'll be emailing everyone a link to it. So there is additional detail there that you can take a look at. All right, last question. Yes, go ahead.
I'm just curious, looking at the jobs where women have been able to increase, you said the military, and it looked like some of the other ones would be more subject to government policy and regulation. Do you think that being required to follow governmental policies has helped increase the number of women in certain workforces, and that the private sector is lagging behind because of the lack of regulation?
I think that's a hard question to answer, because I think you have to look at individual policies rather than looking at it from once again, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. I think you got to look at it on a case-by-case basis. I think there are some that are necessary, that do help to bridge that gap, and that there are others that don't. But I think you have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. So I'm hesitant to make any general comments about policy and the role that the government has, because again, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. All right. Well, thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Von Nessen. Thanks to all of you for your great questions, and there will be many more.